Karen complained about my front porch. It was a memorial for my fallen brother. The house felt too quiet. An echoing silence had settled within its walls since Michael left. A silence that no amount of television or music could truly fill. Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost in her own life, each familiar object a sharp reminder of his absence. The worn armchair in the living room where he used to read his sci-fi novels, the chipped mug in the kitchen that was perpetually stained with his strong black coffee, the basketball still leaning against the garage wall, gathering dust. Each held a phantom touch, a whisper of laughter that was no longer there. It had been 6 months since Michael's last deployment, 6 months since the crisp official letter arrived, bearing the weight of a nation's sorrow and shattering Sarah's world. Her younger brother, her confidant, the goofy kid who used to follow her around like a shadow, was gone, killed in action, thousands of miles away defending ideals they both believed in. The grief was a constant ache, a dull throb that never quite subsided, punctuated by sharp pangs of loss that could bring her to her knees without warning. As a way to cope, to keep his memory alive in the tangible world, Sarah had transformed their small front porch into a memorial. It wasn't grand or elaborate, just a simple, heartfelt collection of items that spoke of Michael, of his life, and of her love for him. A framed photograph of him in his uniform, his smile bright and boyish, sat on a small wooden easel. Beside it, she placed his worn combat boots, carefully cleaned, but still bearing the faint traces of desert dust. A small American flag stood proudly in a weathered clay pot, flanked by solar-powered garden lights that cast a gentle glow in the evenings. She added personal touches, the smooth gray river stones he had collected on their childhood camping trips, a few of his favorite dog-eared paperbacks, a wind chime with a melody that reminded her of the songbirds they used to listen to together. As the seasons changed, so too did the memorial. In the autumn, she added a scattering of colorful leaves. In the winter, a small, unadorned wreath. Now with the arrival of spring, she had planted a border of vibrant bluebonnets, Michael's favorite flower, their cheerful blooms a poignant contrast to the underlying sorrow. The front porch became Sarah's sanctuary. She would sit there in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, feeling a fragile connection to Michael in the quiet stillness. Neighbors would sometimes pause as they walked by, offering a silent nod of respect, a gentle smile of understanding. The memorial was a quiet testament to loss, but also to love and remembrance, a small, visible piece of Sarah's heart laid bare for the world. Their street in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Willow Creek had always been a peaceful one, the houses well-maintained, the lawns neatly manicured. Most of the residents had lived there for years, a comfortable familiarity woven into the fabric of their daily lives. But recently, a new family had moved into the house next door, a stark white modern structure that seemed to clash with the more traditional architecture of the neighborhood. Karen Miller was the matriarch of this new household. She arrived with an air of decisive efficiency, overseeing the unloading of expensive furniture and designer landscaping with a sharp eye and a constant stream of instructions to the movers and gardeners. Karen was a woman who exuded a certain polished perfection. Her blonde hair was always impeccably styled, her clothes were always the latest fashion, and her demeanor suggested a firm belief in her own impeccable taste and standards. From the moment she arrived, Karen seemed to view Willow Creek with a critical eye. Small imperfections that the longtime residents had learned to live with, a slightly overgrown hedge, a mismatched set of lawn chairs, a faded mailbox, seemed to elicit a barely concealed frown. She quickly joined the neighborhood association and, within weeks, had become a vocal advocate for stricter adherence to the community's aesthetic guidelines. Sarah, still deep in her grief, had barely registered the arrival of her new neighbor. She offered a polite wave when they first moved in, but had otherwise remained withdrawn, her focus inward, her solace found on her front porch. She hadn't paid much attention to the flurry of activity next door, the constant coming and going of delivery trucks, the insistent hammering and drilling. The first interaction between Sarah and Karen was innocuous enough. Sarah was tending to her blue bonnets one sunny afternoon when Karen approached her, a perfectly manicured hand holding a pair of gardening shears. "Hello," Karen said, her voice crisp and businesslike, a practiced smile gracing her lips. "I'm Karen Miller, your new neighbor." Sarah replied, offering a small, hesitant smile in return. Welcome to Willow Creek. Thank you, Karen said, her gaze then drifting toward the front porch. Her smile tightened ever so slightly. I was just admiring your display. Sarah's heart clenched instinctively. She braced herself, sensing a criticism lurking beneath the polite facade. It's a memorial, Sarah explained quietly, her voice tinged with a vulnerability she rarely allowed to surface. For my brother, Michael, he passed away. Karen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it seemed to become slightly more guarded. Oh, she said, the single syllable devoid of any real warmth. I see. Well, it's certainly noticeable. The conversation ended shortly after that, Karen offering a perfunctory nod before returning to her perfectly symmetrical rose bushes. But Sarah felt a prickle of unease. There was something in Karen's tone, in the way her eyes had lingered on the memorial, that suggested her noticeability was not a compliment. Over the next few weeks, Sarah noticed Karen's gaze frequently drifting towards her porch. Sometimes as Karen watered her meticulously arranged flower beds, she would pause and stare, a subtle frown creasing her brow. Sarah tried to ignore it, to find comfort in the familiar presence of Michael's things. But the feeling of being watched, of being judged, began to erode her peace. Then came the first formal complaint. Sarah received a polite but official-looking letter from the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association, citing a violation of community guidelines regarding excessive personal items on front porches. The letter requested that she remedy the situation within 10 days. Sarah was stunned. She reread the letter several times, her hands trembling. Excessive personal items? This wasn't just clutter. It was a tribute to her brother, a tangible expression of her grief. She couldn't believe that anyone would find it offensive. She immediately went to see Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman down the street who had lived in Willow Creek for decades and was a respected member of the neighborhood association. Mrs. Henderson listened patiently as Sarah explained the significance of the memorial, her voice breaking with emotion. Mrs. Henderson patted Sarah's hand kindly. Oh, my dear, I had no idea. It's a lovely tribute. Don't you worry, I'll speak to the association. Surely they'll understand once they know the circumstances. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. But a few days later, she received another letter, this one more strongly worded, reiterating the violation and threatening potential fines if the unsightly display was not removed. Confused and hurt, Sarah decided to approach Karen directly. She walked next door, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and a desperate plea for understanding. Karen answered the door, her expression cool and unwelcoming. Karen, Sarah began, trying to keep her voice steady. I received another letter from the neighborhood association about my front porch. I wanted to explain that it's a memorial for my brother, who died serving our country. Karen's expression remained unmoved. Yes, well, I understand your loss, Sarah, but frankly, your memorial is not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Willow Creek. It looks rather cluttered and, I must say, a bit depressing. Sarah stared at her, speechless for a moment. Depressing? It's a reminder of my brother's life. It's how I keep his memory alive. I'm sure you have other ways to remember him, Karen said dismissively, crossing her arms. Perhaps some photographs inside your house? A memorial garden in your backyard? But our front porches are the first impression of our neighborhood. They should be neat and presentable. Neat and presentable, Sarah repeated, her voice rising. My brother gave his life. This is the least I can do to honor him. I respect his service, Karen said, her tone flat and insincere. But that doesn't give you the right to impose your personal grief on the rest of us. Some of us have to look at it every day. The callousness of Karen's words struck Sarah like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes and her voice trembled with anger and hurt. You have no idea what I'm going through, she choked out. This isn't just some clutter. It's a piece of my heart. Karen simply sighed, a gesture of weary impatience. Look, Sarah, I understand you're upset, but the rules are the rules. And frankly, several other neighbors have also expressed concerns about your porch. It's time to take it down. With that, Karen closed the door, leaving Sarah standing on her doorstep, feeling a profound sense of disbelief and a burning injustice. The conflict had been ignited, and Sarah knew that Karen's complaints were not just about aesthetics. They were about a fundamental lack of empathy and respect. The quiet sanctuary she had created to honor her brother had become a battleground, and she knew she would have to fight to protect it. Karen's cold dismissal left Sarah reeling. The sheer lack of empathy, the casual disregard for her grief, and the memory of her brother felt like a fresh wound. She retreated to her porch, the familiar objects of Michael's memorial suddenly imbued with a new layer of vulnerability. The vibrant bluebonnets, which had brought her a small measure of solace, now seemed to stand in defiance against Karen's sterile aesthetic. The neighborhood association letters continued to arrive, each one more insistent than the last. Fines were threatened, and the language became increasingly bureaucratic and impersonal, referring to the memorial as an unauthorized structure and a detriment to property values. Sarah tried to reason with the association members, explaining the profound personal significance of the display, but she sensed Karen's influence. Several members, who had previously offered sympathetic nods, now seemed distant and uncomfortable, echoing Karen's concerns about maintaining community standards. Karen, emboldened by the association's backing, didn't stop at formal complaints. She began a subtle but persistent campaign to turn the other neighbors against Sarah's memorial. During neighborhood gatherings, she would steer conversations towards the unsightly porch, subtly emphasizing the negative impression it created and the potential impact on their property values. She would often use carefully chosen words, cloaking her complaints in the guise of maintaining the neighborhood's charm and cohesion. Some neighbors, swayed by Karen's seemingly reasonable arguments and her forceful personality, began to voice their own concerns, albeit more tentatively. Others, who understood Sarah's grief and admired her quiet tribute, remained supportive, but were hesitant to openly confront Karen. The once peaceful atmosphere of Willow Creek began to fray, a subtle undercurrent of tension replacing the easy camaraderie. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. The casual chats with neighbors during walks became strained, punctuated by awkward silences and averted gazes. She felt like an outsider in her own community, her grief and her way of coping with it deemed unacceptable by the self-appointed arbiter of neighborhood aesthetics. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch, a gentle breeze rustling the wind chimes that reminded her of Michael's laughter, Karen approached her again. This time she carried a glossy magazine showcasing perfectly manicured suburban homes. "Sarah," she began, her tone falsely conciliatory, "I was just looking through this magazine, and I thought it might give you some ideas. Perhaps a more streamlined approach to your remembrance." She flipped through the pages, pointing to minimalist planters and understated wreaths. Sarah stared at the magazine, her anger simmering beneath a layer of profound sadness. "This isn't about aesthetics, Karen," she said, her voice low and steady. "This is about my brother, about honoring his life." Karen sighed dramatically. Of course, but surely there are more tasteful ways to do it. This collection looks rather haphazard." She gestured dismissively at Michael's combat boots, the worn leather a stark contrast to the pristine perfection Karen seemed to crave. "His boots walked on foreign soil to protect people like you," Sarah retorted, her voice sharp. "They are a symbol of his sacrifice." Karen visibly recoiled. "Well, there's no need to be dramatic. I'm simply suggesting that you consider the impact your porch has on the rest of us." The confrontation escalated, voices rising, the quiet evening air filled with the raw emotion of Sarah's grief and Karen's unwavering insistence on her own standards. Other neighbors, drawn by the raised voices, began to emerge from their homes, watching the tense exchange with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. One neighbor, old Mr. Johnson from across the street, a veteran himself, finally stepped in. "Karen," he said, his voice firm, "Sarah's porch is a beautiful tribute to a young man who made the ultimate sacrifice. It's a reminder of the cost of freedom. I, for one, find it deeply moving." Several other neighbors murmured their agreement, their support for Sarah finally finding voice. Karen, momentarily taken aback by this public display of solidarity, retreated, her face flushed with anger. But the respite was brief. Karen, feeling publicly challenged, intensified her efforts. She started documenting every perceived violation of neighborhood guidelines on Sarah's porch, sending a steady stream of emails and photographs to the neighborhood association. She even began taking photographs herself, focusing on what she deemed the most unsightly elements of the memorial. The pressure on Sarah mounted. The association sent more threatening letters, and the subtle ostracization from some neighbors became more pronounced. Sarah felt besieged, her grief compounded by the constant battle to defend her way of remembering her brother. One particularly difficult day, Sarah found a small, anonymous note tucked into her mailbox. It read, "We support you, Sarah. Don't let her win." It was a small gesture, but it reminded Sarah that she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. Inspired by the anonymous support and fueled by her unwavering love for Michael, Sarah decided to take a more public stand. She wrote a heartfelt letter to the Willow Creek Gazette, the local newspaper, detailing her brother's service, her grief, and the significance of the front porch memorial. She described Karen's relentless complaints and the pressure she was facing from the neighborhood association. The letter resonated deeply with the community. Many readers, touched by Sarah's story and outraged by Karen's perceived insensitivity, wrote letters to the editor in support of Sarah. The online comments section of the article became a forum for expressing sympathy and condemnation of Karen's actions. The public outcry put pressure on the Willow Creek Neighborhood Association. Several long-standing members, uncomfortable with the association being used to harass a grieving sister, began to question Karen's motives and the association's rigid adherence to aesthetic rules over human compassion. Karen, however, remained defiant. She gave interviews to a local news channel, portraying herself as a champion of neighborhood standards, decrying the eyesore on Sarah's porch, and insisting that rules were rules, regardless of personal circumstances. Her tone was unwavering, her convictions seemingly absolute. But the tide was turning. More and more neighbors openly expressed their support for Sarah. Some even added small tributes of their own to her porch. A single flower, a small flag, a handwritten note of sympathy. Sarah's memorial was no longer just a personal expression of grief. It had become a symbol of community solidarity against perceived intolerance. Then came the incident with the garden lights. One morning, Sarah found them smashed, the delicate solar panels shattered. A wave of anger and violation washed over her. This was no longer just about complaints. It felt like a deliberate act of malice. Later that day, a neighbor reported seeing Karen near Sarah's porch late the previous night. While there was no direct proof, the suspicion hung heavy in the air. The incident galvanized Sarah's supporters even further. Several neighbors offered to install security cameras on their properties to monitor Sarah's porch. The conflict had reached a boiling point. Sarah, feeling the weight of her grief and the injustice of Karen's actions, knew that the next confrontation would be decisive. The community was watching, and the fragile peace of Willow Creek hung in the balance. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, where Sarah would have to defend not only her memorial, but also her right to grieve in her own way. The destruction of the garden lights felt like a deliberate escalation, a cold act of vandalism that went beyond mere complaints about aesthetics. A knot of anger tightened in Sarah's chest, mingling with the ever-present ache of grief. This wasn't just about Karen disliking her memorial. It felt like a personal attack, a violation of her sacred space of remembrance. The neighbor who had reported seeing Karen near Sarah's porch the previous night, a quiet retiree named Mr. Henderson, no relation to Mrs. Henderson down the street, was hesitant but firm in his account. He hadn't seen Karen actually damage the lights, but he was certain it was her he'd observed lingering near Sarah's property late in the evening, an unusual hour for her to be outside. The circumstantial evidence, coupled with Karen's relentless campaign against the memorial, painted a damning picture in the minds of many in Willow Creek. The incident acted as a catalyst. The simmering tension in the neighborhood finally boiled over. Several neighbors, outraged by the apparent act of malice, openly confronted Karen. Voices were raised in the usually quiet cul-de-sac, accusations flying, the fragile veneer of suburban politeness shattering. Karen, cornered and facing the collective disapproval of her neighbors, retreated into her pristine white house, slamming the door behind her. The Willow Creek Neighborhood Association, already under pressure from the public outcry following Sarah's letter in the Gazette, found itself in a precarious position. The vandalism incident further polarized the community. A faction of longtime residents, horrified by Karen's behavior, demanded that the association publicly support Sarah and condemn the harassment. Others, still clinging to the importance of maintaining property values and community guidelines, remained hesitant to take a definitive stance against one of their most vocal members. Sarah, feeling the weight of the community's support and the sting of Karen's escalating hostility, knew she couldn't remain passive any longer. The destruction of the lights, a small but symbolic act of aggression, had solidified her resolve. She decided to organize a neighborhood gathering at her house, a peaceful demonstration of support for her memorial and a call for respect and understanding. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. By the designated evening, Sarah's front yard was filled with neighbors, their faces reflecting a mixture of concern and solidarity. Many carried small candles or wore blue bonnets pinned to their clothing. Mr. Johnson, the veteran from across the street, stood beside Sarah, his presence a silent testament to the respect Michael deserved. Mrs. Henderson held Sarah's hand, her eyes filled with warmth and support. As the evening deepened, Sarah stood on her porch, the memorial bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Her voice, though tinged with emotion, was clear and strong as she addressed her neighbors. She spoke of Michael not just as a fallen soldier, but as her beloved brother, sharing anecdotes of their childhood, his infectious laughter, his unwavering kindness. She explained the significance of each item on the memorial, how it connected her to his memory, how it helped her navigate her grief. Then her gaze turned towards Karen's house, the windows dark and unyielding. "This memorial," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is not an act of defiance. It is an act of love. It is a way for me to keep Michael's spirit alive in a world that now feels so empty without him. To ask me to remove it is to ask me to erase a part of my heart." A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind chimes. The silence was heavy with shared emotion, with a collective understanding of Sarah's pain and the injustice she was facing. Suddenly, Karen's front door creaked open. She stood on her porch, silhouetted against the dim light from inside her house. A palpable tension rippled through the gathered neighbors. Karen's voice, when it finally came, was surprisingly unsteady. I don't understand why you're all making such a fuss." Several neighbors immediately responded, their voices filled with anger and disappointment. They spoke of Michael's sacrifice, of Sarah's grief, of Karen's perceived insensitivity and relentless harassment. The quiet gathering threatened to erupt into a shouting match. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't about neighborhood aesthetics anymore. This is about basic human decency. This is about respecting the memory of a young man who gave his life for our freedom, and it's about supporting his sister in her grief." The weight of Mr. Johnson's words, coupled with the silent but powerful presence of the gathered community, seemed to have an impact on Karen. She shifted uncomfortably, her usual air of self-assuredness wavering. Then Mrs. Henderson spoke, her voice filled with a gentle but unwavering conviction. "Karen, we welcomed you into our neighborhood. We hoped you would become a part of our community. But your actions towards Sarah have been divisive and hurtful. We believe Sarah has a right to grieve in her own way, and her memorial is a beautiful expression of her love for her brother." The emotional weight of the evening, the collective disapproval of her neighbors, seemed to finally crack Karen's carefully constructed facade. Tears welled in her eyes and her voice broke as she spoke. I didn't understand. It didn't look right to me." Her words, though a small step, were met with skepticism by some. But Sarah, seeing the genuine distress in Karen's face, felt a flicker of something akin to pity. Just then, the local news crew that had been alerted to the neighborhood gathering began to film. The bright lights illuminated the scene, capturing Karen's tearful confession and the silent, watchful faces of her neighbors. The following day, the story of the Willow Creek Memorial and the neighborhood's stand against Karen's complaints became a local news sensation. The footage of Karen's emotional moment, juxtaposed with images of Sarah's heartfelt memorial, sparked a wave of public sympathy for Sarah and condemnation of Karen's initial actions. The Willow Creek Neighborhood Association, facing intense public pressure, issued a formal apology to Sarah and publicly affirmed her right to maintain her memorial. Several members who had initially sided with Karen resigned, and the association pledged to revise its guidelines to be more sensitive to personal expressions of grief and remembrance. Karen, facing public scrutiny and the ostracization of her neighbors, retreated further into her home. The perfect image she had so carefully cultivated had shattered, replaced by a reputation for being insensitive and out of touch with the human cost of loss. The climax arrived a few days later during a live television interview with Sarah on her front porch, the memorial bathed in the warm afternoon sun. As Sarah spoke eloquently about Michael's life and the importance of remembrance, Karen emerged from her house. She walked slowly towards Sarah's porch, her face pale and her eyes downcast. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of bluebonnets, their vibrant color a stark contrast to her somber demeanor. She stopped at the edge of Sarah's porch, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, I... I'm so sorry. I didn't understand. Your memorial, it's beautiful. Michael, he must have been a wonderful person." Tears streamed down her face as she laid the bluebonnets at the base of Michael's photograph. The cameras rolled, capturing the raw emotion of the moment. Sarah, surprised but deeply moved by Karen's unexpected gesture, stepped forward and gently touched Karen's arm. "Thank you, Karen," she said softly. He was everything to me." The tension that had gripped Willow Creek for so long finally seemed to dissipate. The simple act of Karen offering bluebonnets, Michael's favorite flower, felt like a genuine attempt at reconciliation, a recognition of the shared humanity that had been overshadowed by Karen's rigid adherence to her own narrow worldview. The moment was the peak of the drama, the point where Karen's initial antagonism finally began to yield to understanding and remorse, spurred by the community's unwavering support for Sarah and the public exposure of her own insensitivity. The cameras captured not just a conflict, but the potential for healing and empathy to emerge from the ashes of prejudice. The image of Karen kneeling on Sarah's porch, offering the bouquet of bluebonnets, became a defining moment for Willow Creek. The raw emotion captured by the news cameras resonated deeply, sparking conversations about grief, empathy, and the importance of community. The outpouring of support for Sarah intensified, while Karen, facing the consequences of her insensitivity, began a quiet and difficult journey of self-reflection. In the days following the televised apology, an uneasy calm settled over the neighborhood. Karen remained largely out of sight, the pristine white of her house a stark contrast to the vibrant memorial next door. Sarah, while still grieving, felt a measure of peace she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. The community's unwavering support had created a protective embrace around her, and Karen's public remorse, however belated, offered a glimmer of hope for reconciliation. The Willow Creek Neighborhood Association underwent significant changes. The revised guidelines now explicitly protected personal expressions of grief and remembrance, emphasizing compassion and understanding over rigid aesthetic rules. Several new members, more representative of the community's diverse perspectives, joined the board. The association, once a source of stress for Sarah, now seemed to embody a more inclusive and empathetic spirit. Karen's journey towards understanding was a slow and arduous one. The public backlash had been severe. Online forums buzzed with criticism, and even casual acquaintances kept their distance. Stripped of the social validation she had once taken for granted, Karen was forced to confront the impact of her actions. She began to volunteer at a local veterans support organization, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of the sacrifices made by service members and the profound grief experienced by their families. Her initial attempts at volunteering were awkward and met with a degree of skepticism. The veterans and their families remembered her televised insensitivity, but Karen persisted, quietly and diligently performing whatever tasks were asked of her. Listening more than she spoke, slowly, tentatively, some began to see a genuine remorse in her actions. Sarah, though initially wary, observed Karen's efforts from a distance. She saw Karen at the veterans' events, her usual polished demeanor replaced by a quiet humility. One afternoon, Sarah found a handwritten note in her mailbox. It was from Karen, expressing her deepest apologies once more and sharing a small anecdote about a family member who had served in the military, a connection Sarah had been unaware of. Moved by the sincerity of the note, Sarah decided to reach out. She invited Karen over for tea. The meeting was initially tense, filled with unspoken emotions and hesitant words. But as they talked, Sarah sharing memories of Michael and Karen speaking of her own newfound understanding of loss and sacrifice, a fragile bridge began to form between them. Karen never asked Sarah to remove the memorial. Instead, she began to bring small gestures of support, a potted plant for the porch, a quiet offer to help with yard work. These acts, though small, spoke volumes of her changing perspective. The front porch memorial remained a constant in Sarah's life, a tangible link to her brother's memory. But over time, the sharp edges of grief began to soften, replaced by a quiet acceptance and a growing appreciation for the community that had rallied around her. The bluebonnets bloomed every spring, a vibrant testament to Michael's life and a symbol of the unexpected connection that had blossomed between two very different neighbors. Willow Creek, forever changed by the events surrounding Sarah's memorial, became a more compassionate and understanding community. The story of HOA Karens served as a reminder of the importance of empathy and the potential for even the most rigid hearts to soften in the face of genuine human connection. The Ngeep Quat for Karen wasn't just the public backlash, it was the forced introspection and the difficult journey towards understanding and redemption. Years passed. Sarah continued to live in the house filled with Michael's memory, the front porch memorial a permanent fixture, evolving gently with the seasons. Karen, though she never became Sarah's closest friend, became a respectful and supportive neighbor, actively involved in veterans' causes, and a quiet advocate for empathy within the community. The bright colors of the memorial, once deemed an eyesore by one, became a symbol of Willow Creek's heart, a testament to the enduring power of love, remembrance, and the unexpected ways in which adversity can sometimes lead to understanding and even perhaps a measure of healing. The laughter that Karen had not directed at the porch, but rather her dismissive complaints, eventually faded into the background, replaced by the quiet murmur of a community that had learned a valuable lesson about compassion and the true meaning of neighborhood. The resolution wasn't just about Sarah keeping her memorial, it was about the transformation of a community and the unexpected redemption of a woman who had once stood in opposition to its heart.